Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. Today is November 14th. It's Friday. We're on the record from 1 to 1:30. It's 1:03 p.m. We're here to discuss AO 2025-117S, an ordinance submitting to the qualified voters the municipality of Anchorage Ballot Proposition, amending the Anchorage Municipal Charter to adopt a 2% room rental tax to fund public infrastructure and capital improvements, support housing, construction, and cultural and recreation facilities, and to provide for approval by a majority, 50% plus one of qualified voters voting on the question. Start with introductions. Ms. Baldwin-Day.
Aaron Baldwin-Day.
Jared Gerker. Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant on the phone. Mr. Martinez.
Present. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else here? Our attorney's clerk, attorney for the 7th floor, Ms. Brawley.
Okay, thank you. I have a brief set of slides. I'll give an overview and then happy to take questions. I know we just have a half hour. So if we can go to the next slide. I will cover what this ordinance does, and I will also say there is an S version. I'll go over what those changes were made, but substantively it's the same. So there's no kind of policy choice that's different in the S version. So what this does, it asks voters to approve a 2% increase to our room rental tax or bed tax. Room rental is what we use in the actual code for all room rentals less than 30 days. So hotel, B&B, short-term rental, any of those that fit in our existing bed tax. This dedicates that revenue, approximately $6.5 to $7 million a year. There's a C, so you can look at how they map that out. This would be dedicated in the charter to two different uses. Half of it, or 1%, would go to public infrastructure for housing, which I'll unpack shortly. And then the other half would go to operations and or capital funding for cultural and recreational facilities. That's the general language. I didn't do a screenshot, but you have the ordinance in front of you. This essentially layers onto the existing bed tax collection. So you'll see in the C, there's no substantive cost to implement it because it's literally changing some forms to collect that additional percent. So there is some initial work that would happen. But it would be adding on to what we have. It does not make any changes to the existing bed tax, which is 12%. It does not change those revenue dedications. This literally is just on top of what we already have. I know there's been a lot of discussion about those other pieces. So just to be clear, this isn't making changes to what's already there. This would be effective January 2nd, 2027. The reason January 2nd is because if you stay overnight for New Year's Eve at a hotel, the question would be, are you charged on December 31st or January 1st? And so that takes that question off the table. However, because of the relatively small cost to implement this, it could in theory start in 2026. So I contemplated that as a possibility, but ended up not doing that. It would start then, but just to say. Next slide, please. So context for this, and I know this is one of several revenue proposals on the table. I'm really just saying kind of my rationale for this idea. It's worth asking, is it time for a change? So I went back, in 1975, there was a bed tax established. There might have been one prior to the Muni being created. I didn't do the deep dive, but it used to be 5%. And thanks to Visit Anchorage, who outlines this on their website. Then it was increased in 1979 to 8%. And I believe that must have been at the time when they did the 4 and 4 split. Originally, it was just for destination marketing. That's part of what is being used for now. And then the other 4% goes to general government. So then fast forward to 2005, there was a charter amendment to dedicate a 4% increase in the bed tax. So it went to 12%, which is where it is now, in order to build the Denina Center across the street, as well as make improvements to the existing convention center, Egan Center. That's how it's been used. And we know that has been a whole discussion about what happens with that in the future as well. That is not what this touches at all. But just to note here, the last vote and the last change to this tax was 20 years ago. So it's just a question I would like to put on the table, regardless of what this ends up looking like. This is something that we could consider changing because it's been 20 years. Next slide, please. These next couple slides are just going over general industry trends. Oh, sorry, Jamie, if you can do the next slide. Oh. No, it's okay. So this is really just to show some of the industry trends in the hospitality industry overall, because of course this is looking at hotels, short-term rentals, all of it. This is just to note, and I know this is a little hard to read on the screen, the largest hotel companies, this is I believe in the world, it depends on which what you're using. This is from 2025. So of course, Marriott, Hilton, IHG is, I think, International Hotel Group. That's got a lot of the Best Western, things like that. Hyatt, you see a bunch of names there. So over time, we have seen more and more consolidation and what they say here, chainification of the hotel market. So just to say, a lot of this market, and I didn't do a deep dive in Anchorage specifically, a lot of it really is major hotel chains, right? So there are certainly independent hotels. We know we have some here, but a lot of this is very large companies. So just not that in itself is not a reason to tax things, but just to note this, we should be looking at the industry as a whole when we talk about looking at the bed tax. Next slide, please. Also looking at kind of what is going to get built in the future. And so this is a projection from Grandview Research. There's a lot of kind of hotel or hospitality industry analysis out there. And they're showing that really the largest growth in the market is luxury and upscale. So this is thinking probably what would get built and what kind of the demand is. And you'll see there's also mid-scale and economy. Those are, the budget motels. But I think the point being that if we continue to see hotels built, including here, it's likely going to be high-end hotels. And so that's also something to keep in mind as we talk about kind of the growth of this industry here. We do know that there's been some being built right now in Midtown. There's been recently. We also know there's a trend in extended stay, having a suite or having a kitchen facility. Like that's another kind of way that this industry has been moving toward. Next slide, please. And then also really I didn't dig super deep into the question of short-term rentals versus hotels. About 10 years ago, there was a whole fight over, Airbnb disrupting this industry and all of those things. And that's certainly an ongoing trend. But this is showing from 2023, what I could find, how visitors really engage or make bookings. And so there's booking.com, which does both short-term rentals and hotels. Airbnb is in there, Expedia, et cetera. And then of course the different industry websites from some of those major hotel chains. I have links there that can be accessed in the PDF. It's just an interesting thing to look at kind of how this industry has changed over time. And so my general argument is that we should look at taxing the industry as a whole if we're going to make tax changes. Next slide, please. So looking briefly at the dedications, what could 1% for infrastructure do? I did quote the proposed charter language here. There's two separate pieces. I'm thinking of this as really what is the public benefit for this tax money? So it's written in a way that it would allow for example, at least partially funding water and sewer improvements, sidewalks, road connections, the public infrastructure that is required for developers to put in. It could also be utilized through grants or loans to defray capital costs for housing, meaning let's say a project mostly pencils, maybe it's an affordable housing project and it needs $500,000. There's a lot of projects like that. The Alaska, blanking on the acronym, but the essentially our state housing trust used this kind of money for a number of projects in Nome and other places to basically make them pencil, make them happen. So that's another option. This also could support, I know there's been discussions about our own housing trust, a revolving loan fund, other mechanisms, and so this could feed into that. So it's not a lot of money. It'd be about $3 million, but it would be, it could be used for that purpose. Next slide. What could the other 1% be used for? What I was imagining, the language is general. It just says operations or capital for these types of facilities. It could be for making improvements to, or really having, we know utility costs have gone up. We know a lot of costs have gone up. So it could help with existing facilities. So that could be recreation centers, libraries, other cultural facilities. I know when I first was thinking about this, it was uncertain how, for example, the Performing Arts Center problem would be solved. We know that in the meantime has been at least partially addressed. But we also know there's other cultural pillars in town, some of which are publicly owned, some of which are not. But that would be a discussion as well to really help support those facilities. It could also be used instead of general operating funding for more intentional projects, enhancing quality of life for residents, promoting economic development, special programming, increased access to amenities such as covering costs for certain populations, whatever it could be, public art installations. There's a lot of ways that it could be used. The ballot measure itself is not specific to that, but I am offering these as just kind of general potential intent for this. Again, not very much money, but ways to use it creatively to achieve some of our broad goals. Next slide, please. So what's different in the S version? As I said, there's not substantive changes. It makes two changes to the intent to make it clear. One is it adds room tax or room rental tax to the title. Before it just said tax. So just to be super clear in the record what it was for. And then second is that it allows for exemptions. And so this is something that is also not technically required in the charter because the assembly can adopt exemptions by ordinance already. But it makes that clear for voters. And so that's the only changes in the S version. But that's why I'm moving with that one. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. So exemption idea. This is one, again, that is not in the charter language, so not in the ordinance, but I documented in the memo with the S version and why I wanted to put that exemption language in there. One thought is, for example, we could exempt properties from this additional 2% tax if they have in-unit or shared kitchen facilities. I mentioned extended stay properties are being developed more and more. They're a bigger segment of the market. We also know from experience in Anchorage that as the life cycle of a hotel building is that it is built, it is used for a hotel purpose. Often it ages and then the property may or may not make updates to it. But as it ages, it becomes a lower value property or lower price point property. And eventually it, in Anchorage anyway, has become de facto low income housing. There's a number of them in my district on Spenard Road. Some of them have been converted, the Lakeshore Inn, the Barrett Inn. There's others that have not been converted yet, but we know people live there for housing. And at some point, they aren't even generating bed tax anymore. If somebody is staying for more than 30 days, the property may be a hotel, but it's not necessarily generating a lot of bed tax because of the nature of the stays there. So if we are looking at companies building hotel properties, then perhaps it is worth thinking, can we incentivize, even in a small way, those companies building extended stay instead of more traditional hotels? And of course, these major companies do what they're going to do, but this would give it a little bit of advantage in the market. And then the benefit to the public long-term would be that if more extended stay or more properties with kitchen facilities built now, 20, 30 years from now, those are potentially ripe for conversion into housing and less capital expense than having to put in a kitchen or having to retrofit units with at least a partial kitchen. It would make them look more like small apartments to begin with. So I offer that idea. It's not in the ordinance itself and is not what the public would vote on, but it's something I wanted to put on the table of potentially considering in general. How do we incentivize more of these types of properties with the idea that they become eventual housing inventory, maybe. Next slide, please. So what this ordinance doesn't do, and I was clear about this in the original memo, this doesn't solve our bigger picture problems, right? It is one small thing and it's trying to chip away at a couple of them. So it doesn't offset other taxes. It only increases revenue. It doesn't touch core services, right? We know that's a big issue. This isn't doing that and it's not trying to do that. It's not enough money to build a new facility. It's not like what we did with the Denina with that 4%. And again, it doesn't raise enough revenue to even address all of our infrastructure needs that are tied to housing construction. So it's, I just want to be honest, right? This is not the fix all. It's just an option to put on the table. And next slide, please. I think this is the last one. So next steps, it's back on the agenda. And as I said, it's just one revenue idea to ask voters. Maybe 2026 is not the year. Maybe this is ripe for a different year or a different ballot, but wanted to put it in there as part of the mix. So that's my presentation. I'll take questions.
Jared?
So how does this interact? I know we've got multiple tax proposals around the bed tax in general right now. So if, and maybe since you're the sponsor of the other one, you can kind of cue me in a bit. Look, if this one passes, are you going to still push forward with the 5% for just the short-term rentals or vice versa? Like how are these two going to interact?
So I think that the current agenda as it's set up has the 5% question first. And so I understand my co-sponsor is pretty intent on moving it forward on Tuesday. We'll see where the calendar leaves us. And so I don't think it interacts directly. It just would compound if both were on the ballot and both passed. And so, but I don't know the math of the possibility of both getting past the body and getting on the ballot and passing the voters is pretty astronomically small.
Right. So potentially though, the voters could be voting on a 5% and a 2% for a total of 7% for the short-term rental.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll say for my part, and I said this back when I introduced it, I am putting this forward as an option that I think is worth talking about. In the wake of the Project Anchorage discussions this spring, I had said on the record, I do think we should look at increasing bed tax to at least address part of what they were talking about in investing in ourselves and the nexus with tourism. But I've also said that I would be willing to withdraw this. I would be willing to consider it in a future year. And so it is on the agenda. I'm also willing to postpone it because again, we don't have to decide this until January. So
Right.
that is my intent, is for my part.
Right, and just again, to the point, like, I would also be in the category of, we're passing a budget Tuesday night.
Right.
Let's spend our time thinking about the budget and then get all the business, talk about revenue later. But Daniel is gonna do what Daniel does, and I'm not gonna get in his way. And so the way it comes up on Tuesday will depend on the will of the body, really.
Okay.
And so, but ultimately, there is some logic to carrying all of the revenue questions to a point in time and doing, again, more kind of work session and thought on how we would approach any of these questions, in part or in whole.
Yeah. And just one, if I could, one more. Is there any intent to, it sounds like for the 5%, no, but for the 2%, would there be any interest in holding off and seeing what it looks like for the mayors? Because obviously she's got a 3% sales tax as well. Like, are we going to flood the zone with, I guess if the mayor's sales taxes looks like it's going to pass, is there any interest in any of the sponsors for these other ones to hold off, or does that answer the revenue questions, concerns you guys have, or all of this going to be happening all at once?
Yeah, I think for my party, and I've said this to the mayor directly when I had this introduced, is I wanted to put this on the table as an option. I would be willing to withdraw it or consider it for 2027 or another year. And so, so I would be happy to have this on the table during the discussion. I am not necessarily assuming this makes it on the ballot. And I would, for my part, not assume that we would put 4 questions on the ballot. And so I think it is, I just think in these bigger conversations about revenue and our fiscal situation and how we can solve different problems, this is an option. And that's the way I've been talking about it. And so I don't see this as, I guess I'll say, like I said, I'm willing to withdraw this if that becomes the move.
Okay.
For my part on the theme, I believe the one that's proposed by Mr. Vollen, it's somewhat different than all the rest of them because it has a very intent focus, a very intent outcome that's narrow and for purpose. And so, but again, I personally would be okay if the item gets postponed into a broader conversation when we have more time after we've crossed the threshold of the budget.
Yeah.
I will kind of honor Daniel's intent, whatever comes
Yeah,
up.
totally respect and appreciate that. Can I just add just a comment real quick? So I do have in front of you a amendment that I will be introducing for every tax proposal that comes in front of us, which is basically to add a sunset provision to or require recertification by the voters every 5 years on any of these new tax initiatives for the 1%, the 3%, the 5%, the 2%. Are there any other taxes? Anyone who's got anything up their sleeve? Because I think that's.
I hear there's a gecko tax coming.
There's not. You've heard wrong. So just FYI, don't be surprised when you see those. I'm happy to go into more detail if you like, but just FYI.
I guess one clarifying question back. So at least on this one, because this is the only one for this work session, would the sunset be on just this 2% or would it touch other parts of the bed tax?
Just the 2%.
Offer, make sure that language is really carefully written because the charter amendment opens that whole section of the charter. And so you don't want to add a sunset clause on that other part incidentally. Ms. Baldwin Day.
Thank you. On the implementation side of this question, are you envisioning that we would have new dedicated funds that would emerge out of this tax? Like we would create a public infrastructure fund, we would create a cultural and recreational facilities fund, or what would that look like on the back end?
Yeah, good question. I think when we dedicate revenue in general, by default, it does go into its own fund. I am not necessarily imagining it being like, the same as the alcohol tax. For example, there's these other conversations about, a broader housing fund. This could flow into that. I think the key is that it would not be under the cap. It would not be part of core services. And then similarly, the cultural and recreation fund, I think it depends on how it would be utilized. Similar, we do have CIP funds, right? When projects pass, there's those kind of project specific funds. So it could end up like that, not with one named project, or it could be decided that maybe it is going toward, operating funding for a bunch of facilities or something like that. And so I didn't map that out specifically, but I am imagining that this could, again, feed into kind of other conversations or supplement other funding. And hopefully that answers your question. I guess I'll also note too, in terms of when the money would be available, we know hotel tax or bed tax is seasonal. And so our largest collection of it is in the summer in quarter two, well, mostly quarter three, some of quarter two, and we don't get that until September. And so there would be a lag in terms of when the money is available. And so I would imagine, practically speaking, even if this went into effect in 2026, that it would be for 2020, I guess 2028 maybe, when the first money would be programmed, which, I mean, with the marijuana tax, there was a year before any of the money went out the door because we had to figure out where that went. So there would be a lag. Thanks.
So one follow-up question then, so would we be, so would the assembly be appropriating revenue from a dedicated fund, or would that be something that would be happening, that project prioritization would be happening on the administrative side of the house? Like, how is that structured?
I think it, again, would depend on kind of what other decisions are made or where that money would go. I mean, so one scenario is that, yes, it would be like alcohol tax and it would simply be for line item appropriations. Another one is that, again, the housing fund could flow into another fund source and blend with other funds there. And then a third one could be that maybe there is some kind of prioritized culture, like facilities needs, because we know there's a lot of those needs as well. And so I could imagine it going multiple different ways.
Mr. Meyer.
Do you have any information about the negative impact of increasing the bed tax? What it's going to do to tourism, or potentially people going to the valley or going to the Kenai instead of renting a place in Anchorage? And then Jamie, could you go back one?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I know there's been, we have some information about kind of what average taxes are, and it really depends on, how you count all that. I didn't do a deep dive on how this would impact. I mean, I think the operating question there would be how inelastic is the demand for hotels? We know Anchorage also has medical travel. I mean, some of these may be exempt depending on who's buying it, conferences, things like that. And so I don't know how much we would see a shift to other communities just because of the nature of Anchorage. But I also have not had a deep dive conversation about this. I do know during Project Anchorage, which again is not a live proposal, all of the hotel companies were in favor of a 3% sales tax increase and did not indicate that. However, there was the offset of property tax relief, so I'm not assuming that they would necessarily support this.
Well, and I believe during Project Anchorage too, though, it was brought up in several of the discussions that it would not be an increase in bed tax. It was a sales tax only. So, and then doesn't offset other taxes, only increases revenue. But I would like to exchange revenue for taxes. I mean, it's increasing taxes. So anyway, that was only my comment.
Anyone else? Yeah, I want to close this out.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions. And we'll have this on the agenda Tuesday. And as I said, I would not be surprised if it gets postponed. Thanks.
With that, we'll be adjourned and convening on Tuesday to take up certain matters. Thank you all.